We're now going to talk about how we make decisions about the wording of individual questions in a survey. First, we see whether or not a question can be misunderstood. So, generally we got to be careful about questions that we think we understand. Questions like nationality, marital status, even questions that we use in the field of communication like mass media. These are very broad, general questions. So if I ask you what mass media did you consume, it's very hard to understand what it is I'm referring to. And you would think that because you're in the field of communication where a lot of people use that term, a lot of people understand it. Likewise, nationality is a very, very difficult term for people to understand because some people are citizens, some people are students, some people are not necessarily, they have dual citizenship. So these are questions that you need to consider before you create your instrument. So these are all ideas about whether the question can be misunderstood. What assumptions does the question make? So for instance, if you ask what a person's social class is, you assume that they know what social class is to begin with, right? So if that is the case, you may want to ask a previous question saying, do you understand what social class means? Or you can explain it and say, social class means, your income and education and your lifestyle. Now I'm going to ask you, where do you fit within, let's say, a scale of lifestyle or social class? We also have to consider time frame. So if we ask a generic question such as, do you think Congress will cut taxes? Or another one which says, do you think Congress will successfully resist tax cuts? Neither of these questions specify a time frame. I mean, Congress is going to, cut taxes at some point. It's going to increase taxes at other points. But are we talking about a congressional cycle? Are we talking about a year, 3 months from now? What are we talking about? So let's be specific. Same goes for things like, media consumption. So if I ask you, how many emails did you receive? That's very open-ended because you don't know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a week, a month, a year. So you got to be very specific in terms of the time frame. We also have to be careful about wording. Generally, if we ask questions like, are working conditions satisfactory or not satisfactory, as against, are you personally satisfied with working conditions in the place you work in, you realize that one is an extremely personal way of asking the question because you're personally asking the person, and the second is something that you ask in a second person context, right? And sometimes you may use the former, which is, are working conditions satisfactory or not, without wanting to get that person to get too worried about what the consequences of answering a particular question might be. We also have to wonder about whether wording is too direct, right? How did you feel about the war, about being in the war? So if you ask a veteran that, this is a very direct question. We have to think about these things. We also have to think about things like, are the wordings difficult? Is there terminology? Are we being too direct? Do we need to kind of, make it indirect? Do we want to ask about what do they generally think about wars in general? Or do they understand what we mean by a war or what we mean by a battle? And these are all technical terms, although we use it in everyday speech. When we have many alternatives, let's make sure that each alternative is explicit. If we're using objectionable wording, try to make sure that the wording is not, objectionable, and we're not making remarks or using terminologies which are making people uncomfortable. We also have to make sure that the wording is not loaded or slanted. In other words, we don't want to ask a question by saying only the positive aspects. We want to ask people a question and give them the opportunity to provide a complete set of responses. We also have to make decisions about the response format. Should the response format be check the answer, fill in the blanks, circle the answer? Now, every self-report instrument might have a different way of doing it. If we have dichotomous, multiple choice, scaled questions, which one do we want to use? If we have open-ended questions, which one do we want to use? And these are all decisions that we have to make. And so creating an instrument is as much science as it is art. And we have to make sure that when we write a survey, we clearly specify all the issues and meet all the requirements. And one way of doing this is to write your instrument and to pilot test it, pre-test it with a small group of people and look to see if they understand it. If you're hitting all these markers and you're getting your survey ready, then we say we've designed an appropriate instrument.